So looking now at step 1 of the application process, the vehicle details. So the most important thing in regards to the vehicle details is step 1, ensuring that you are selecting the correct vehicle configuration. It is the most important thing. Depending on the heavy vehicle combination that you select is dependent on the fields that you'll get in order to complete. So if we look at a B-double application, a Class 2, all it's going to ask you really for is whether it's a GML or HML, how long the combination is, how high the combination is. There's no requirements for registration or axle mass and spacings, so on and so forth. So it's one of our more simpler applications. Comparing that to an oversize over mass application, we need all of your unladen mass and dimensions, all of your laden mass and dimensions, we need all of the registrations, we need all of the axle mass and spacing. So depending on what configuration you select is dependent on what fields you'll see. So it's very, very important. You'll hear me say a lot today that it is important to make sure that all of these details in the application are accurate to avoid any additional information requests later on in the process. So if you are unsure about anything, there are a range of different people you can call. You can call the hypercare team. The numbers will be at the end of today's presentation. You can call any member of the NHVR that you have their contact details for. They'll be more than happy to provide that advice up front so that you are completing the correct application and therefore avoiding any additional information requests. The same thing goes, especially with the Class 1 or Class 3 application that allows you to select whether you're oversize, over mass, or oversize and over mass. Once again, it's really important to make sure that you're selecting the correct option there, because once again, that's going to open up some required fields that you need to complete. And of course, just completing all of the required fields for your heavy vehicle combination. I've just noted there that if you do want to shortcut this particular process, you can utilize the vehicle configuration functionality as demonstrated earlier in today's training, or you can also utilize the copying and application functionality from the application tracker as demonstrated just before. Okay, so I'm going to jump now back to step 1, the vehicle details in my training environment of the portal. So I'm already in my application here. As I said, the most important part, step 1, select configuration, is making sure you are selecting the most appropriate heavy vehicle here. For this demonstration, I am going to select the oversize over mass application purely to demonstrate the most complex application. So selecting oversize over mass. And as I said earlier, the only thing in this demonstration today that is not the exact match to the live NHVR portal is the list of configurations that you see here. So you will notice that I have a shorter list of configurations in the live and the true solution of the NHVR portal. You'll see prime mover, low loader, a range of different oversize over mass combinations. So I'm just going to select on this little prime mover icon here for today's demonstration. The same functionality in the live solution of the portal. Maybe you need to add a dolly into that configuration. You can always remove the last component and selecting here to add component. Now, once again, these diagrams today are not the true diagrams that you'll see in the live solution of the portal. So just for today's demonstration, I'm just going to select a low loader trailer. Okay, so I've got my prime mover, my low loader. You can see here under the overall tab, you've got the oversize, over mass, or oversize and over mass. So as I said, it is very, very important to make sure you are selecting the correct thing. Depending on these options will open up more required fields that you need to complete, and that the regulator and the road managers need to see and assess. So if you're oversize, it means that you are 42.5 tonne or less as your loaded or your total mass. If you exceed 42.5 tonne, it means that you are over mass. Okay, so maybe you're just over dimensional, or maybe you are just over mass, or maybe you are oversized and over mass. So if you are over mass as a class 1 oversize over mass or load carrying combination, it means that we need your completed axle mass and spacings breakdown. And the application is only going to prompt you to complete those fields if you correctly identify that you are over mass. If you're just oversized, it won't require you to complete the axle mass and spacings. But of course, if you are over mass, we need those details. So it's important to select that you are over mass, and then of course complete the axle mass and spacings breakdown. Now bear with me, I'm just once again going to complete all of these mandatory fields with a bit of fake information just off the top of my head. But essentially, as long as you've selected the correct vehicle diagram up here, you've selected the correct oversize, overmass, or oversize and overmass, you just need to continue now and complete all of the mandatory fields. So for unladen or unloaded, okay, and then below that we've got the loaded details. So load type, is it indivisible or divisible? Maximum mass of the load. Now also this is a good thing to point out. The portal will automatically take your TAN mass, the maximum mass of the load, it will add those two together and it will give you your total mass, which is really the most important thing. Now the total mass field is not an amendable field, so if it hasn't added up the mass to the correct total mass, it's just about going back and changing that particular field. You just need to select the tick box here that says I certify the maximum mass of the load and continue to complete the loaded or the laden mass, mass and dimensions. Okay, so once again, if this was an SPV application, definitely requires a forward projection, so selecting that tick box there and completing that detail, or selecting the rear overhang if required, and once again completing that detail. Okay, then coming across always for all heavy vehicle combinations, class 1, 2 and 3, PBS or HML, we need to make sure that we're always selecting over into these additional little icon fields. So making sure that we do have the correct axles, which is the most important part of the diagram, is ensuring the correct number of axles for both or for all of the components. And then it's just about adding in the registration details, adding in the correct axle mass and spacings breakdown. Okay, so something to note, if you're under the prime mover, it's only the prime mover registrations and it's only the axle mass and spacings related to the prime mover. Jumping now to the low loader, once again ensuring that I have the correct axles and therefore the correct configuration, and then it's only the registrations for the low loader and only the axle mass and spacings for the low loader as well. Now at any point in time, if I was to change the configuration after I've completed all this detail, just keep in mind that it is going to then clear my details. So just to show you, you can see now, because it is a different application, different fields for different combinations, you can see there it's just, it essentially deleted all of that information I put in earlier, and I now need to complete all of the information for the new configuration. So I'm now going to go through all the crane details just quickly before we move on to the next step of the application. So you can see here, as a crane, it's only giving you one option as oversized and overmass, and that's because we need your axle mass and spacings, doesn't matter how heavy you are. Okay, so length now. Actually, before I do that, I'm just going to select the correct number of axles so that my diagram looks a bit better. Length, width, height, total mass. Because your crane doesn't actually carry a load, it is always going to have the specific mass and dimensions. That is why you only have to fill out length, width, height. comparing that to the oversize over mass load carrying application where you had the unladen and the loaded mass and dimensions, you can start to see here the differences between the actual applications and the fields that you need to complete depending on the configuration that was selected. So for cranes, especially, for all cranes that don't include a dolly, you always need a forward projection. So ensuring that that field is always ticked and completed. And once again, you are also always going to need a rear overhang. Okay, and of course adding any details about permit schemes, but always coming across, it doesn't matter what heavy vehicle you are, and selecting on the additional little icon here next to the overall tab and completing in this detail as well. So I did it earlier, but I did very quickly. This diagram, no, it is not the correct color that matches your crane. It might not even be the correct sort of axle spacings, but the most important thing about this diagram is actually ensuring the number of axles is correct. Okay, so ensuring, just selecting from this list here, and you can see we also have the crane and dolly combinations all included within the all-terrain crane option. And then it's about completing the registration details. Now for a crane, because we are looking at the crane application, just a little hint or a tip. As long as that crane is exactly the same mass, dimensions, it's exactly the same number of axles, you are able to have multiple registrations on the permit. But it essentially means I've gone to the manufacturer and I've bought 4 of the exact same crane. So it must be exactly the same mass, exactly the same dimensions, exactly the same amount of axles and spacing. So the axle mass and spacing breakdown must be identical for it to have multiple registrations on this permit. But if I did need to add multiple registrations, just selecting into the next line here and completing in that detail. As I said earlier in today's complete training, because the registration module is now available in the NHVR portal for customers to view the registration details, it is actually linked to the access permit section now, so you can actually see the status, whether it's registered, not registered, or just not found here because I've entered in some fake details. So in order for the NHVR to issue a permit, a heavy vehicle road access permit, we must have registered vehicles on here. So if something was to come up as not registered, by all means you can submit it as a part of your application, but it is going to cause some dramas if there's not some additional clarification behind that. So just something to be conscious about. And then it's about completing the details here. So bear with me, I'm just going to very quickly complete this information, just so that we get no red flags as we try to continue throughout the rest of the application. So as I said, I'm just going to be completing some of the details here so that I can continue on with the application without any incorrect fields. So because all of these fields here are mandatory, you can see the little red asterisks. If I try to complete or move on to the next step of my application, it will actually flag that this entire step 1 is incomplete. So it will flag as red, which just is indicated to the customer that, hey, you need to complete the missing information. And if you do have any missing information throughout the entire application, it won't actually allow you to submit it. Okay, so this entire thing will turn red, which is just an indicator that you have missed some fields there, some mandatory fields. So I have just completed all of the vehicle details for step 1. So just before we continue, some of the important takeaways there, making sure you select the correct heavy vehicle configuration, ensuring that you're selecting the correct mass, of course, to prompt you onto completing the axle mass and spacings, ensuring that the little diagram at the top of your page here, the most important thing with that diagram is just the number of axles. That must be correct. And then, of course, all of the mandatory fields need to be completed. And you do have some fields that are not mandatory, but just keep in mind for things like cranes, where we do need a forward projection and a rear overhang, please make sure you are including that information to avoid additional information requests in the future. Now, if you have any issues or uncertainties, or you're not confident with some of the information you're putting into these fields, I do recommend a quick call to the NHVR and to our hypercare team. It's important that we are completing these applications as accurate as we possibly can to avoid any additional information requests or any kinks in the process later on that's going to slow us down. So if you are uncertain about anything, quick call to the hypercare team. They'll walk you through it over the phone. There are some fields later on in the application where you can sort of add some free text notes or some attachments. So if there is any dramas like an unregistered vehicle that is actually registered, you can attach the registration document or so on and so forth, just to provide that additional clarification for the details.